Hi, this is Pastor Barry back with the supplement video for Chapter 8 of Discipleship Essentials, Made in God's Image. And this is a much easier chapter than the previous one, even if it's somewhat repetitious. There's good in that repetition. The memory verse, the inductive Bible study, and the reading all kind of say the same thing, and they even say it in the same way. The basic idea is that the peak of God's creative work was that humankind, both male and female, were created in the image of God. And he spends a little bit of time exploring what that means. I'll do a little bit more of that in this video as well. One thing that I'll note that's missing from the chapter is in Ogden's talking about how we reflect the image of God, he doesn't talk about a lot of the traditional things that people talk about when they think of that. Historically, at least from what I remember, people talk about intellect. We have intellect like God. We can think. We have feelings like God. We have a will to choose, moral responsibility like God has. We have creativity. And I think all of those things are true. There are also things that are true of individual people. And it seems like what Ogden is doing here is a good job of trying to emphasize something that often gets neglected, doesn't get talked about much, which is how we reflect the image of God, not just individually, but in our relationships with one another. So let's dig into this a little bit. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. Like I said, much of this is repetition. He goes to Genesis 1 and 2 over and over and over again. So I'm not going to keep repeating that for you. But let me just hit a couple of highlights here. There in the memory verse guide, they asked the question about how the creation formula changes. And, you know, in Genesis 1, God says, let there be, let there be, let there be, until he comes to humanity. And then he says, let us create people in our own image. And so I saw in that both that God is more like intimately involved, and we see that fleshed out in chapter 2, but also that human beings are special. They're created in the image of God in a way that nothing else in all of creation is. A little bit later in that memory verse guide, they ask the question about God referring to himself in the plural, let us create humanity in our image. And he asks what could be the reason for this. And of course, kind of hearkening back to last week's lesson on the Trinity, that plural hints at the nature of God, that God, even though he's one God, is more than one person. And part of what that reveals about what it means to be made in the image of God is that the image of God is unity, but it's not unity by there just being one person. It's unity from this plurality. It's unity in diversity. And so we see that, or we saw it last week, in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We see it in humanity in at least two different ways, maybe more. I guess more, three different ways. One is, in this passage, gender. Male and female, he created them. And so it's not male that's creating the image of God or female, but it's male and female together reflect the image of God in a way that neither one of them does individually. It's also why it's important that when we talk about marriage, that marriage is between a man and a woman, because it reflects that image of God that he's trying to reflect in the world, or that he intends for us to reflect in the world. A second way that we reflect this kind of unity in diversity is in our ethnicity. And this is why it's important that we have relationships, especially as Christians, with people who look different than we do, who come from a different cultural and maybe language kind of background, because our oneness in Jesus and our oneness in our humanity is greater than the things that separate us. A third thing that I'll throw in here, and this is actually a New Testament thing that he doesn't quote, but from Galatians 3:28 would be social standing or class. He says that there's neither Jew nor Greek, that's racial or ethnic, right? Slave nor free is social standing, and then male and female. So they used that as an early Christian baptismal formation. When you got baptized into the kind of community where it didn't make a difference if you were male or female. It didn't make a difference if you were slave or free. Your standing in the community didn't depend on your social standing. And those are things that we're still trying to learn how to live out today. One last thing from that memory verse study guide is he talks about the authority that humans are given to rule over all creation and every creature and the earth itself. And he asks, what does that responsibility imply? And I just wanted to say that I think it has something to do with not only stewarding the earth, but doing it in a way that God would, right? We're made in the image of God to bear his image, and to be able to bear that image, we have to rule over creation in a way that God would. And we have to think about, how does God relate to his creation, and what does that teach us? I think we learn a lot about that in the person of Jesus, who comes and instead of insisting on, on everybody bowing down to him, he actually lays down his life for them. And so Jesus does want worship, but it's interesting that in the way that he presents himself, rather than having you lay down your life for him because he's the king, he actually lays down his life for you. And so what does that mean for us as the rulers of creation? To be the kind of kings over creation that Jesus is, and to come as servants and not as exploiters. One last thing I'll note about Genesis 1 and 2, so this kind of goes not only into the memory verse, but also to the Bible study, is a question. There are a lot of Christians who make a big, it's more than making a big distinction, they make a hierarchical distinction between men and women. They say that men are meant to rule, and women are meant to follow, that men are meant to have authority and women are meant to help out. And I don't think we see that here. If you look at Genesis 1 and 2, I want you to look through there and find for me the evidence of hierarchy, the evidence that actually Adam was meant to rule and Eve was meant to kind of follow him around. I don't think we see that. The man and the woman, they don't have names yet, are made as co-rulers of creation and are given the responsibility for kind of managing and caring for creation. In the section on the reading, I just wanted to highlight one thing from this question about the implications of the biblical view of humans and how we understand the worth of individuals. I think this is super important because it's so different from the world that we live in. See, it's from the Bible and it's from being made in the image of God that we gain the value that every human being is special, that they're made in God's image, and that they have intrinsic worth because they're made in God's image. Also, that love matters and that relationships matter because we were made in God's image for relationships, just like God himself is in relationship, Father to Son, Father to Holy Spirit, Son to Spirit. So that is the image of God that we're trying to reflect in the world. So relationships become super important, and it's a very different thing than people coming about as the result of a naturalistic evolutionary process where human beings are just higher order animals. If that were true, then we would just be animals competing with the other species and with one another. And so love would actually be a disadvantage potentially, or at least we should make love be the kind of thing that always benefits me. And so, yeah, I think that the implications of this biblical view of being created by God in God's image are super, super important. Okay, some stuff that you want to get to if you're leading this study or if you're just a participant in the study. One thing is to uh, draw connections between this week and last week. To be made in the image of God and to understand what the implications of that are, we need to understand what God is like. And that's why that lesson on the Trinity is so important, that the members of the Trinity are not ordered hierarchically. They are submitted to one another. They love one another. They share a common purpose. They're completely unified. And this is the picture of the calling that God has for us as image bearers in the world. A second thing that you want to get to is some theological reflection. Uh, it's important to think about how the image of God, or being made in the image of God, affects our thinking about other aspects of theology. It changes our thinking about sin. If we're made to be in the image of God, then sin is more than just the breaking of a rule. It's the perversion, it's the twisting of that image of God that he means for us to reflect in the world. And sin is not just like bad things I do. Often it's the breaking of the relationships with people around me, because then I am not reflecting the image of God, where Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share one mind and one mission, one heart. Um, so sin becomes the destruction of the image of God that we're supposed to bear in the world. And then salvation is about the restoration of that image. It's why uh, salvation is about more than just getting into right relationship with God. It is about people's dignity being restored. It's about justice being done in the world. It's about forgiveness and reconciliation between former enemies, or between people that love one another but are having a conflict, because that's the image of God. That's what God is like. And then it tells us something about our mission. So our mission is not just to wait around until Jesus comes back. It's not even just to tell people to get into a right relationship with Jesus. It is to join God in this mission of restoring the image of God in the world. That includes the proclamation of the gospel in words, but it also includes being out feeding the hungry. It includes setting the enslaved free, because that allows them to be uh, to more fully sort of carry the image of God in the world. So you want to get to connections from last week. You want to get to some of these theological reflection pieces, I think, and maybe not. Maybe I'm just an egghead. There is a reason I'm a pastor. But the last thing that you definitely want to get to, even if you don't do the theological reflection pieces as much, is I think you want to get to application. You want to help people to embrace this idea that their relationships really matter. And one concrete thing you can do is actually have people get their schedules out and schedule some things that will prioritize their relationships. It's one thing to say, "Oh yeah, the guy in the essay is right. It's really important to prioritize my relationships." It's another thing to get your schedule out and schedule a date with your spouse, or to build in special time with your kids, or to build in time to serve together, to proclaim the good news about Jesus in word and in deed. The other thing that you can do in terms of applications is to actually schedule a time together to go out and serve together. And we have those in your calendar. You can find them on the website. But look for something that you can do together and talk about it, debrief. It's more than just the serving. It's understanding what we do when we join God and what he is doing in restoring the image of God in the world. So God bless you this week in Discipleship Essentials. Have a great time, and I'll see you next week.